So against all odds, you and a group of friends play D&D every week, or maybe every month. You play regularly enough, which means you've suddenly gone from playing D&D on a small scale to playing D&D in the way that I feel like it's intended to be, and that is a grand campaign. But a grand campaign needs something specific. A villain. Hello everybody, I'm Jake, and this is Unpopular Culture, and today we're discussing crafting villains. And now there's different levels of villains, and I kind of break them up personally into three categories. You can break them up however you want, but and take any lesson you would like out of any of these categories and apply them anywhere else. But I personally think there's about three. It's battle, meaning it's a villain that basically is going to be around for one fight or a very short time, maybe half a session, not even quite. Then there's the session level bad guy, which may be 1 or 2 sessions, could be 3 or 4, doesn't matter. But it shouldn't be. These are the villains that aren't necessarily arc builders. You don't build a whole story around them as far as like major plot hooks, but maybe something comes of them. It could be. And then there's campaign villains. This is the big bad. This is the Joker. This is not the henchman. And we're going to talk about all three. So first, let's start out. What even is a villain? Does a villain have to be inherently evil? And that's no. A villain is anybody who is trying to do a thing that the players end up disagreeing with, or in trying to prevent, or trying to get in the way of. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual physical fight. We don't have to think about villains as things we get to punch and hit with swords and cast spells on. It can also be something we have a debate with. It could be something that we, I don't know, have to race against, like maybe time in general is a villain. It could just be your players sat down at a bar and now they're having a drinking contest with, I don't know, someone else at the bar. That happens to be your villain for just this moment. This is sort of the battle villain. One that, as a DM, you don't necessarily go in with a huge backstory. You don't have to know their motivations outside of like 1 or 2 things. Like, why is the guy sitting down at the bar? You don't have to come up with a backstory like, oh, his wife kicked him out of the house, but he was in the right and she was actually in the wrong, and so he's just having a bad day and he's feeling grumpy and he wants to pick a fight, but the way he chooses to fight is to have drinking contests with people. It doesn't have to be that. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. What it can just be is this is an NPC that happens to want to get drunk, and he challenges someone to a drinking contest, and your characters happen to say yes. That's fine. It can also be an actual thing you fight. For instance, and I mentioned this a few times, just a bugbear. I had one that was rather unique, but never really had any dialogue, that was just for a battle. But it was a memorable fight, I think. Villains on this scale are more very cursory glances at what a villain actually is. It's really just a temporary antagonist. And again, it doesn't have to be necessarily evil or even a person. It can be a shipwreck, it could be a storm. But not something, again, that you would build like an arc around. So think about that. Like, I want to make a villain, and maybe I want to make it very unique, but just for a battle. Okay, what are some things that we can do that make a battle interesting? Is it interesting to, say, fight 10 bandits? It could be. But And I think you should have bandit fights, don't get me wrong. It's not D&D without a good bandit fight. But after you do that once, maybe even twice, it gets a little stale. So what if these bandits are a little bit different? What if you homebrew a little bit? And just give each of them a 1d6 explosive device. Maybe like a grenade, but you can call it whatever you want. And it explodes in a 5-foot radius. Meaning basically any 2-3 characters that are standing next to each other all get hit. But it also, maybe they have to make a strength check, maybe a low one. Maybe a DC 10, DC 11 strength check to knock out prone. And it immediately adds this sort of, I don't know, dynamic to the game that these bandits can cause status effects they normally can't cause. You could also do a thing where instead of 10 bandits, make it 3 bandits and then maybe one that's in charge. but it's not a normal bandit. Maybe this bandit happens to be a magic user, and they are using their spell casting to steal people's shit. I mean, that happens in D&D all the time. I can't imagine there's a reason why bandits are only ever people with swords. I mean, you could make the argument that someone with magic could get a better, status in life. But maybe they just like it, you know what I mean? And that suddenly becomes a much more interesting character. It's almost something you want to build a little bit of a story about. And you can, because we're going to talk about a session baddie, a session villain. And maybe that's something like the magic-wielding bandit. Maybe you start out, you see these 10 bandits, maybe those 10 bandits have the grenades, and wow, there's bandits in the area, that's strange. Why are the bandits in the area? Maybe one of them has a map that leads back to the hideout because they're a brand new recruit, happened to die just kind of on the way. Maybe to rob someone or something to prove their worth, kind of like the Foot Clan in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Remember the old one? So the players can follow the map back, and then there's the magic casting bandit. And you could technically make it a dungeon at that point. We talked about dungeons in the last episode, and you could totally do that if you wanted. But it also doesn't have to be. It can just be a shack. And so you go there, and maybe that bandit is like, whoa, hey, yeah, I'm a bandit, but we only steal from the bad guys. And maybe there's a bad guy army. Maybe they stop and ransack very frequently or regularly supply runs by this particular faction that the players happen to be against. Now that offers this sort of twist on the bandit. Is the bandit actually a bad guy? Well, maybe for a little bit they believe he isn't, and then it turns out, yeah, he does do that, but he also steals from everybody else. It doesn't really matter. And now you have a more layered and interesting bandit. Now, what if the bandit's like, yeah, you could kill me right now, but I have a lot of money locked away somewhere secret that you'll never find. If you help me out with whatever, maybe knocking over one of those caravans yourself, because you just killed 10 of my men, I can't really afford to, I'll pay you double what I was going to pay them. And then you can do that. And that's interesting, especially if you have like a neutral or bad party, or maybe just one that happens to be against that particular faction, that's fine too. And then it lets you add another twist. What if you go there and there happens to be, I don't know, a couple children with them? How do you handle that situation? Do you get paid? Or do you just bail out? Do you warn them? It adds so much for your characters to deal with. I assume most of you play with people that aren't going to kill kids, but if you are with some, that's even more interesting. Because now your player group is a bunch of kid killers. It makes them pretty infamous in the land, and I find that pretty, I don't know. It's a good point of writing, I think. What else makes a good session enemy or villain in general? Because again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad guy. I think it's an interesting voice that you can roleplay with, because I think anyone that is worth writing around for a session or two or more should have a voice that isn't typical. Like, it shouldn't just be, yeah, I'm the Bandit King. You guys want to go knock over a supply run? That's just Jake talking to you. That's just me, right? But what if, I don't know, what if he's got one eye and he kind of talks like this because he's always chewing on tobacco. And now I look like a jackass, but you're immediately talking to the Bandit King and not Jake, which is much more fucking interesting. I don't know. I think that's more interesting. Maybe I'm just an asshole. Which is fine. But I think it really helps your players unfurl a little bit, especially if you play like once a month. My group plays once a week, so it's kind of easy to jump back into character, which none of them do voices, but there's parts of them that turn into the character, you know what I mean? But if you play once a month, it might be a little bit harder to get back into that. Having session baddies, or someone at least worthy of a new voice, and it could be anyone, like maybe you're the type of DM that just wants to do voices constantly, that's great, absolutely encourage it. But these are the types, this is the level where I start doing like real voice work that isn't, and real acting, for lack of a better term, you know, for the players, and just I have fun doing that. So yeah, it's worth it. Now, as far as backstory, this is where you can kind of get a little bit more of a backstory if you'd like, because you never know what's going to happen. So if it's someone that you decide that you want to write around And I say write loosely. You don't necessarily have to like pen to paper or type on a keyboard for it to be writing. Writing can be it can be go on in your head. So maybe you have a backstory involved for the Bandit King, and I don't know, maybe he lost his eye to this particular faction in this particular group, and maybe all that's on those things is the tobacco he likes, and you killed kids for kind of no reason other than money, of course. Maybe he's an asshole and he intended you to die, and when you get back, he's like, I actually don't have the money. So I mean, it could be all sorts of things, but a backstory here is cursory. It can just be like very basic motivation like that, like it's just his favorite tobacco or whatever. And if that character happens to turn into something that you keep long term, that's fantastic. Those are the little gifts that a party will give you every once in a while. They'll just really happen to like a character or find them interesting, and you get really good roleplay out of it. Don't squander those opportunities when they pop up, and don't assume just because you made a session villain, they don't have the opportunity to turn into a campaign one. Or I guess there's a little bit in between session and campaign, but I find campaign villains to be the following: something you build an arc around, something you write for, and again, it can just take place in your head. But these are the kinds of villains that have a backstory. These are the kinds of villains that often you should make maybe a little sympathetic at times, or they could just be straight up evil. Like Vecna is not sympathetic in the least, but I think someone like on Critical Role, maybe the Briarwoods, while they are pure evil and they have basically no redeeming qualities, they do love each other, and so there's a little bit in there that at least they have somewhat connective tendrils coming out into humanity. There's at least something there that touches what we think of when we think of humanity. So something like that. They can be totally irredeemable, but still likable. I think of someone like, again, the Joker is kind of that character. In basically any iteration, I think Heath Ledger is probably the best on screen, but I think comic book or, Mark Hamill's animated Joker, they really have nothing you would want in a person, but they're so attractively twisted that that's something you can work on. Now, I don't think you should just rip off the Joker. I actually have an analog for the Joker a little bit in one of my things, but it's almost like the Joker if he never became the Kingpin that he is in the comics and in the shows and the movies and stuff. So he's more of a session one. He's a recurring. I think another good name for a session villain is recurring, because they could possibly recur. Now, a session villain can also be killed in a few sessions and not have to recur, so I didn't want to call it recurring. But session villains are kind of just enough is there to where maybe your characters want to run into them again or whatever. But a campaign one, you kind of don't want to run into them. It should feel like maybe you're forced into it, or and not by, I don't mean railroaded, but by the circumstances of the game. As heroes, you ought to try to intervene. There's this sort of thing in writing adventure novels and movies and stuff like that. Like Frodo is thrust into this situation in Lord of the Rings, but everybody around him and just loosely connected to Frodo is also thrust in as the nature of it. It's almost like divinely puppeted around, and that's kind of how D&D is. Adventurers find themselves in trouble more than the average person, just by the nature of their job, and also because you are the DM, meaning you are the universe that those players live in kind of focuses on them a little bit more, or a lot of it more, than the average citizen that also lives in that world, if that makes sense. So campaign villains are kind of the same way. They're always on a collision course with your players. You could make a session villain that has actually only ever met one time, even though you intended to meet them several times, just because of the decisions your players make. That's fine, but the campaign ones, they're not unavoidable altogether. It's just that if the players do avoid them, there are consequences that are probably negatives. So, for instance, I'm just going to make this up off the top of my head. This is not a villain that we have in our game currently. Maybe it could be if I have a particular good idea, but I don't even know what I'm about to say yet. So here we go. Let's say there's a god of war, But that God of War doesn't want to be the God of War anymore. The only way for the God of War to not be the God of War is for someone else to be that. Maybe the villain is creating wars to prevent having to cause wars. That's interesting, right? What if near the end of your campaign, in this whole time, the players are butting heads against the lieutenants of the God of War? You have several gods also trying to kill the God of War because he's tearing apart the planet with this massive war, trying to, when in his eyes, kind of like when you spray Lysol on a surface, it says it kills 99.9% of bacteria. It leaves only the strongest of bacteria behind it, if any survive at all. And that's kind of the same thing. Once wiped away from war, only the strongest will be able to survive, which odds are your players, and a few people like them. Maybe he wants to pick one of them to be the God of War and succeed him, and they have to defeat him in a battle for that transaction to take place. So it's not necessarily a bad guy. He's just a guy doing bad things, right? A God of War can be a thing that is good. It can help the good guys in wars. But in this scenario, it's a selfish thing, and that could be really interesting. I don't have a God of War in my campaign, but consider that. Consider maybe what seems like the obvious motive to the players. The God of War creates wars because he's the God of War, that's what the God of War does, isn't the actual answer. The God of War wants to not be the God of War, but needs someone strong enough to take his place, or he's unable to leave his ethereal space. You understand? So it could be something like that. You could take the, a Vecna approach, where it's a guy and he's a lich, and eventually he wants to ascend into godhood. And that can happen. That can absolutely happen. I'm not going to personally steal the Vecna thing, even though I think it would be very fun. Maybe, I say maybe, probably in a D&D campaign that reaches high levels, which I intend to make this one reach, and my players seem hell-bent on getting to level 20, it seems to me that they probably will run into a few liches in their time, or at least, demi-liches, Draco-liches, somewhere in there, but never Vecna. That doesn't even exist in my universe, so... But I guess I could take that. It just depends on what happens. Maybe the big bad I have for them now, which they know is the Necromancer, maybe that guy ends up, because of them fucking up, the players fucking up, maybe he ends up being a lich or something. I know his motivations and they don't, and so I'm not going to talk about them right now in case they watch the video. But, I mean, someone working in necromancy like that would, be aware of lichdom. So, maybe that's a possibility. I have no idea. And that kind of brings me to a question someone had about campaign level villains, is do you have to know how their story is going to end before you start playing even? Like, is that someone, do we start with all the seasons of Breaking Bad in our heads, and we know what happens to Walter White? Or do we not know? Do we only have the pilot episode of Walter White's story in our heads? And it really doesn't matter. Except I would argue as a DM, never box yourself into an ending, because you don't know what your players are going to do. They could absolutely, accidentally, because I have the Necromancer statically on the map, more dynamically on the map, depending on what he's doing, during certain time periods. And so they could technically run into him, and by some miracle, choose to fight and defeat. Although I really doubt that at this point, given their level and his, respectively. He can command, for the record, and the players don't know how he does this, but he can command thousands of undead at one time. So a person that can do that certainly is not even close to being in even fight for my players right now. Who just became level 6, for the record. But I guess that leads to another thing. The campaign level villain needs to run on a calendar alongside your players. That's kind of the difference. They should be doing things in the world. Like every 10 days, say, what is my bad guy doing? It could be the same thing he did 10 days ago. Maybe he's working on something, or, where is he? Who knows? Because you never know where your players are going to be over the course of a year, right? So I say every session, sit down and plot the next 10 days for your bad guy, depending on where they're at, right? Or just really loosely, if they're on the other side of the planet and the characters don't have any access to anything that would get them to the other side of the planet or the other side of the map or wherever your space is, then there's no real need, but there should be some idea. Also, what are their motivations? We talked about it with the god thing. The god of war wants to not be the god of war anymore, but he can't just say that because he has to die based on any sort of, you're the DM, you can make it up. The laws of the god of war is they have to try to fight, like an actual battle, and lose. They can't just, like, off themselves, they'll just be the god of war still, because someone has to ascend to that throne of god of warness and deserve it. They have to deserve to be there. So he has to actually try to kill the players in that fight before, even though he wants to lose, he has to try to win to make sure his loss means something. Does that make sense? Otherwise, he'll just regain form and be the god of war again and nothing changes. Consider that. Maybe consider, besides, maybe not a god of war, maybe it's just a wizard. And it starts out a wizard that your players know. Maybe it's just a random NPC in some town and they know him, and one of his bonds or something, maybe his character, his player trait, is he just wants to seek power. That's normal for a spellcaster, especially a wizard. But what if that power over time becomes not enough? If you watched Black Mirror recently, they adapted a story written by Penn Jillette about a doctor who he gets like a little head mesh thing that can fit over a patient's head, which allows him, because of an implant, to feel the pain of his patients. What if that wizard craves power the same way that guy ends up craving pain? Maybe the wizard finds a stone or something, or some sort of artifact, and gains immediate arcane energy out of it, and it leads him to the next artifact, which leads him to the next artifact, which leads him to the next. That could be interesting. It could be a good guy that is just trying to fulfill his own hedonism, but he accidentally does bad things on the way. Like, maybe every time he takes one of these artifacts, okay, a city falls into the earth just to be snapped shut. These artifacts are kind of what keeps these cities from breaking down. Maybe there's a magical imbuement to them, or maybe they're floating cities or whatever. Every once in a while, the whole map is dotted with floating cities, and he has to take these crystals from the bottom of them, or these artifacts, or whatever they happen to be, tesseracts, to sate his hunger for these things. And he knows people are going to die, but it means so much more to him to take the edge off of his addiction to this pain, that not having this power causes him, that it's worth it to him. And so he takes it and he plane shifts out of there. And maybe the players have to deal with the fact that, like, if they stop this guy from doing that, that'll kill him, but it'll save other people, which is important. But it could be, especially if it's someone they like, consider that. I wouldn't consider doing too many bait and switch type campaign level bad guys. I don't think every time the character's being lied to until the last second is good. I think that at that point they expect a twist. Sometimes have it maybe red herrings that it's going to be something else. Maybe that wizard says he needs it, and they cut him off from it, and they put him in prison, and he doesn't die. Why would he die? Maybe he says he's going to die, but they say, okay, well, we'll put you in like a little hospice. We'll take care of you. You'll be painless till the end. And he's just there, stewing with anger at the players. And eventually he breaks out or something. I think that could be interesting too. So don't box yourself in. Campaign baddies should be very interesting in more than just how you fight them. They should have face-to-face time with the players. There should be conversations had, debates. There can be fighting more than one time, but there doesn't have to be. There can just be one big fight. There never even has to be a fight, honestly. But it has to be contentious, and it should be someone that all the players want to take down for some reason or another. For instance, Hugo, my girlfriend, and our friend Alex are all pretty good characters. Sometimes they do questionable things, but it's usually in the name of doing good things. Does that make sense? And then Hugo's girlfriend's character, not necessarily good. Often does selfish things. Often does very reckless things. Often does things that are bamboozling to almost everyone at the table, but happen to work out. Is an interesting character to play with. So what if she wants to be the god of war, but none of the other players do, but she isn't picked? What happens then? That's interesting. Or she is picked and now has the powers of a god. What does she do? Is she the new big bad for the next campaign? There doesn't have to be an answer now when you're starting this out, but consider these avenues that the players might take. Or they may just surprise you. And if they do surprise you, try to say yes to them. But if you do fight a campaign villain, it should be interesting. There should be layer actions. There should be legendary actions. There should be maybe healing every round called regeneration. There should be possibility for real player death in this case. It's the big bad. It's not a bugbear. It's not some goblins. It's not some bandits. It's the big bad guy. He wants the players dead, most likely, if you're fighting. So try to kill them. Don't cheat. That's not fun for anybody. But if someone makes a mistake, punish them for it. If the enemy they're fighting would punish them for mistakes, punish them. For instance, Hugo's girlfriend ran directly at, she is a rogue, and she ran directly at one of the most armored, most heavy-hitting, and highest HP'd villains in a battle. It happened to work out because her dex is so high, she has a 17 AC herself, so she's also hard to hit. But he rolled 2, 3, or 4 in 6 consecutive rolls. She got very statistically lucky, like very lucky. He only had to roll like a 9 to hit her? So, punishing players for that. I went and swung at her every time. Now, she didn't die, but she got down to 3 hit points at one point, and then the other players bailed her out. I mean, that's just the scenario of it. Sometimes, like, Hugo made a mistake once, and he got lit on fire and sent almost to death immediately. Now, luckily, the other players get turns too, and they can help out. But, you learn from their mistakes and exploit them when you can. Consider things that don't normally happen in big villain fights. Maybe roll them 2 initiatives. Maybe roll 1 initiative for the villain to do normal stuff, and then another one for them to do something else. That's kind of cheating, but not really. If you let the players know that he has 2 initiatives, it's kind of like legendary actions, but in that scenario, I don't know that I would give them also legendary actions. Does that make sense? They have 2 initiatives. They're just that good. It's whatever. It can be very different to action economy, I guess. Usually I would do the second one with disadvantage, though, in that scenario, just to kind of get them. If they're a big bad, they're probably near the top of the order, and then they'll be probably near the bottom third of the order, which I like. I like that space in between. If not, and they do have legendary actions, that happens on reactions, so that's also fine. Layer actions make the layers very interesting. If you saw the Vecna fight in Critical Role, there was floating platforms. If it is, I don't know, say my Necromancer, say they fight in a graveyard, maybe a reaction is he can summon a zombie in the graveyard. It'll have a certain number that he can summon because there's only so many graves, right? And that's something that happens during a layer action, not his action. Maybe there's dynamic things happening all the time. For example, I had a painter recently, and if you watch the videos, you probably know about it. He could paint something to help him in battle, and I rolled on a table for it. It added a lot of variety. He had like 10 choices. We only got through 3 of them. I don't know how the battle would have gone different had he picked any of the other ones on accident. So who knows? Consider giving them things like flying, or maybe it's underwater, which makes it much harder for non-amphibious player characters to do. Maybe it's high up, maybe it's in the cold, maybe it's near fire. Consider changing it up quite a bit, and consider their damage output for non-spell attacks. Do you want your big bad to be able to one-shot, meaning hit them one time and kill them? I think that's kind of boring. So adjust their hit die based on much like the traps when we did the dungeon episode, per hit. Now they can have multiple attacks, which maybe one-shots them, but it'd be more like 2, 3, or 4-shot them. But they still have to hit for that, so I find that totally fair. I don't like the idea of having, I don't know, 5d10 melee attacks, and then just, like, killing your rogue and your bard and your wizard right away with, like, a swing. When there's so many more interesting things to do besides just swing at something and hit it, maybe when they swing and hit with a particular weapon, maybe it's a sword with the blade just made out of, like, just what looks like a galaxy. And so they swing and hit, and every time the players have to make a Constitution or a Charisma save or something, or be banished to a celestial plane for just until the end of their next turn or something. Madness is interesting. Making one of the other players attack their fellow friends. That's interesting. We had that happen in that painter fight, I believe. Ivelios, the ranger who does a lot of fucking damage, got Crown of Madness on him, and he had to fight his own friends. So that was interesting, and they were really worried when he got that because they know how much damage he does and how easy it is to hit. So consider this kind of thing. Also, make sure to allow tactics to be done. Like, make sure you're using half cover, 3/4 cover, full cover for terrain features. Keep in mind how, like, flight and stuff, especially at higher levels, a lot of people have access to flying. And always allow your characters to be prepared for things. I like to add different mechanics. For instance, they're in a city under siege right now, and they have a mechanic called retreat and then seek aid. So in a fight, if it becomes too much, because every certain number of rounds, new enemies will show up. So it's like waves, and they have to fight the person in charge. These are orcs fighting. So basically the lieutenant, and then they have to fight whatever units they have with them. And then if they don't defeat them in so many rounds, there will be another one stacking on top of that, coming in waves, because the way my orcs fight is, it's kind of like waves on a beach that poof, 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 slowly eroding the defenses of stuff, kind of like an accordion. They push in, they pull back, they push further, pull back a little bit, push further, pull back. And so they also have a sniper in the lighthouse. But if they want to retreat, what happens is they can all roll a pretty low dex save. It's 10 plus the number of the wave. So if they are on the first wave and they decide to retreat, it's an 11. If it's third, it's 13. So it's not super hard to escape, but then they have to roll. If they fail it, they still get to escape, but they get to roll 1d4. But if they nat 1 it, they roll 1d6, and that's the amount of attacks of opportunity they provoke while leaving, regardless of their distance. Just running away, these long-range weapons can be fired at them, which I think makes a lot of sense. And so they get possible damage on the way out when they could die from it, especially if things are pretty dire. And then I allow them to seek aid. They have to make a survival roll, which is 15 plus the wave number, so it's a little bit higher. But they have the opportunity to look through the city while it's being broken down and sort of besieged, and find potions and other helpful things, maybe helpful people. They also have a really interesting thing called reinforcements, where in the middle of a battle, or before, I guess, if they wanted to use it, doesn't matter. It takes an action to shoot this. Basically, it's a Roman candle that has a flare inside of it, and it shoots up. And then they roll on a table, and then the next round on their turn, reinforcements will arrive based on what they rolled. Last time they got an apprentice wizard and a bard, and the bard actually survived and did really well, and the apprentice wizard got killed immediately. They could get some villagers. They got a knight once who got just his ass kicked, but he was very helpful as far as damage soaking. And you let them use those characters however they want. They get to play those extra characters, which is fun. It kind of lets them DM a little bit, if that makes sense. And it also takes a little bit less work for me. So yeah, keep in mind, like, you can make it interesting. It doesn't always have to be the same. You can use the stuff they have to make these fights big. And in a campaign level baddie, I would do something like that. Now, they haven't actually fought a campaign baddie yet. I'm sure it's coming up at some point. They're actually geographically nearby, and they found that out last session, so I can say that. We'll see what happens. I have no idea if they're going to run into that the Necromancer anytime soon. It's kind of up to them and what they want to do, but we'll see. More things about the campaign baddie. Over time, kind of let your players inform you, and then take those ideas and write them down, and maybe you'll come up with an interesting bad guy based on something they do. For example, all of my characters right now are multi-classing. My Rangers is also going to put a point into Blood Hunter. The Cleric is going to do Sorcerer. The Bard is going to do a Wizard, and the Rogue is going to do Fighter, so they can 2-weapon fight. All of which are very interesting, but they're all doing it at the same time. We just got to level 6 in the middle of this city siege, and they're kind of doing a long rest back at a keep while the rest of the reinforcements go out, and then the 4 of them who are basically the champions of the city right now, like de facto champions of the city, that they decided to stay. They didn't have to. They're all kind of going through this change at this one time over this one night. And so I think that's really interesting. I think I'm going to take an opportunity to do some role-playing with that. And actually have a monster hunter that they traveled with very briefly in the Feywild and then brought to this city, and then it happened to be under siege, who is going to help the Ranger become actually the Blood Hunter, which I think makes a lot of sense. It just happens to work out that he wants to be a Blood Hunter now, and there's a monster hunter. So I'm gonna make that work. I have some ideas for the other stuff, but I'm not going to spoil it. So take opportunities like that. Now, I'm not saying there's going to be a campaign baddie pop up when they level up this next session, and there's not going to be. But maybe there's something serendipitous like that happens. Maybe they happen to be in this city, and they happen to do some things that make you go, oh man, it would be really cool if the Big Bad showed up, but in my head he was across the map doing something else. Have them show up. It's okay. It can be, it doesn't have to be written out. It doesn't have to be what you planned. Always allow yourself to adapt to the players, and if it would be a very cool moment, allow it to happen. At a certain point, I suggest you write out their backstory, stuff that the characters wouldn't have anything to do with. Much like you're writing a character that you want to play D&D with, I think you should do with your real good villains. I think you should at least go back to the point that they changed from being a normal person to the thing that they are now. Maybe they were never a normal person. Maybe they were only born for destruction, that's fine. But at what point is Vecna no longer like a magic user and he wants to become a lich? At what point is he a lich? At what point does he try to become a god and ascend? Same thing applies to the Joker. We're all very interested in like his origins. The Joe Chill from the Tim Burton movie, or you know, Heath Ledger's performance in like, you know, I got these scars, that sort of thing. It's interesting. Whether or not it's true is another thing, but you, the DM, should know the truth most likely, or at least a vague truth. Maybe even you don't want to know, but and you keep it nebulous on purpose, but maybe there's your truth, right? Maybe there's the player's truth as well. Maybe those two things are different. Consider these things. It'll help you as a writer if you like writing, but it'll definitely help you as a DM if you write them as if they were characters you want to play because you're the DM, you are playing them, right? So it's kind of their campaign too. Maybe even level them up. Maybe roleplay by yourself if that's a thing you're into, and keep a character sheet and level them up alongside. Every time the players level them up too. Don't just assume because a villain is powerful that they're actually villainous, right? An interesting villain is born of creativity, not just power. A villain can be a Lex Luthor who isn't powerful, he's just a genius, right? If my players were to fight a Lex Luthor, they would destroy him immediately, because he's just a guy. Now, Lex Luthor with his power armor stuff is a little bit different, but Lex Luthor the guy is no match. That's why his intellect comes into play. That's why he's an interesting villain for Superman. Consider that. Consider the motivations as well. We talked about the god, but maybe we talk about Vecna lichdom. Maybe it's just a guy. Maybe he's just a guy. Maybe it's that same wizard that was stealing the crystals earlier. These things need to be fleshed out over the course of the game, but not ahead of time necessarily, right? And then lastly, make it fun for yourself. The DM, it doesn't have to be bad. Try to beat your players, because you're going to lose 99% of the time. It's almost your job to lose all the time. But sometimes you can win. Sometimes you don't have to kill your players either. Maybe they run into your big bad early and it was an accident. And maybe you think, well, he doesn't even know who these people are. Maybe he doesn't actually kill them. Maybe he's not that murderous. Maybe he's just like, go to another plane of existence and die there. I don't have time for this. It's much easier for him to go like this and snap him out of existence than spend several rounds fighting and taking damage, right? And when he can just pop them out of existence for a little bit? Okay, go to the Feywild. You're done. That's interesting. That's something that the characters remember. Oh, fuck, that guy's so powerful, he just popped us away. Like it was nothing. He brushed us aside. We thought we were hot shit until we met that guy. That's the kind of thing a campaign villain is made for. And I guess that's it. So, thanks guys for watching. If you have any questions, make sure to ask them down below in the doobly-doo, and I'll try to answer them. I'm probably going to be doing a question and answer video soon about D&D, because we've a few more videos in, and I'm pretty sure I have enough to actually make content for it and answer some real good questions. Because some questions I can't just answer in a text or a reply in a comment section. Some of them deserve, you know, a little bit of a talk. So hopefully we can do that. If you guys like this channel, go ahead and subscribe. If you like this video, give it a like and a share, and tell your friends. You know, tweet about it and whatnot. I'm at Papa Bird Jake on the Twitter. We also have a Discord, discord.me/Hugo and Jake. Hugo's not here for the D&D stuff usually, but I am, and I'm on the Discord a lot, so go ahead in there. We do have a tabletop section if you're interested. We also do other stuff. It doesn't always have to be D&D. We do things. That's not the only thing that I talk about. And if you have any suggestions for the next video, go ahead and leave a comment and say, I want you to talk about this in a whole video, and I think I'm real special, and this is the best question you've ever looked at, Jake, then I will look at it and see. I usually take these based on requests, because we're kind of past the point where you can start out, but there's so much to D&D that I want to make sure that I talk about it. Maybe we'll do, and we can, maybe not, I don't know. If you guys are into Critical Role, it's a fantastic show. If you are new to D&D, or you've been a fan of D&D but never seen Critical Role, I strongly suggest it. It's put on by Geek and Sundry. They have several voice actors that play D&D, and if you want to learn D&D and be entertained at the same time, there's no better way. You will learn the rules to D&D real passively. You'll learn how to play what I consider to be the right way, not to be, you know, exclusionary of people that play differently, but I think personally, at least when you come to my house and I'm the DM and this is how we play, that's the right way. You sit down, you role play, you have a good time with your friends, there's jokes, it could be a little crass at times, that's fine, but you got your dice, you got your player sheets, you got your pen and paper, and you have a good story, basically, that you're telling together, and that's important to me. So, yeah, if you have any suggestions, go ahead and put them down there, and maybe I'll do a companion thing to Critical Role, maybe not, who knows. It could be a lot of fun, though. So, let me know if that's something you want, because I think maybe I could get into that. My girlfriend's a huge fan, too, so maybe she'll join me, and we'll talk about Crit Role, and that could be a good time. So, anyways, this is Unpop. I'm Jake. Thank you for watching so much. I love you like a son. Or daughter. I love... If you're a lady, I still love you like a son, though. Throwing footballs around and stuff. Okay.